Today we're here to talk about the go, no-go framework for AI agents. And it crossed my mind that this morning we heard a lot about trust, but pushing a half-built agent into production can really detract from that trust and cause a lot of user attrition. So right now, we're finding that making that decision is part and parcel of having a good deployment. And the challenge is no longer building pilots. A lot of people are building pilots at this point, and product managers are often tasked to build pilots that connect to roadmaps. So what we're seeing is that there's a huge process underlying any successful agent deployment. And I'm very pleased that we have some experts here to talk about how to get out of pilot purgatory and into successful deployments with AI agents. First, we have Harshdeep Singh from Amazon's AGI unit, where he manages the news domain. He's a senior technical product manager, and he does data for the news domain for Alexa Plus. Welcome, Harshdeep. Perfect. And then we have Shahar Arez. And Shahar, you may have heard his keynote earlier this morning. Shahar is co-founder and CEO of Arato, who is a sponsor of today's event. Arato is a Gen AI testing and quality platform headquartered in Israel. And I'm super excited to hear more about the long tail of unpredictability in AI agents. Welcome. And our panel would not be complete without Chris Miles, a product lead for AI and chatbots with Labara. Labara operates in 5 European countries and serves 5 million users, so a very scaled operation. Welcome, Chris. Perfect. So, Harshdeep, this first question starts with you. At Amazon scale, when you introduce an agent, it reaches millions of users within hours. How do you validate AI systems before they go to production, and what does that staged process rollout look like?
Yeah, so the basic mental model is that we are moving away from the traditional software development and deployment cycle where you launch something and maintain it. Agents are something which operate continuously, and you have to monitor them relentlessly for accuracy, right? The first step actually starts with defining the success criteria and the metrics to actually monitor after an agent moves into production. Once you have that, the very critical step is for internal dogfooding of your agents. Amazon fortunately has a huge employee base where these agents can actually be tested internally to figure out for edge scenario test cases. But for cases where this kind of internal dogfooding is not a mechanism, there's a strong recommendation of creating a user base for simulating these options internally. So that you can invest and get these understanding of the edge cases which might fail in production by the actual users once your agent is in production. The next step is for stress testing. There's there should definitely be some mechanism for introducing game days where thousands of users either internally or externally come for testing the use case like a real user. For you to figure out your stress level and performance levels. And then also figuring out the guardrails for what you define, which are not safe for work content or sensitive categories. Yeah, and then defining the staged rollout mechanism of how much do you employ, how much do you deploy, and things like that. And then on the metrics front, I think a pretty important metric from a singular metric is something which we are moving into a compound one, which is relevance, which stands for usefulness, accuracy, and freshness. So measuring that through a human in the loop, which is pretty important, who will grade your sample set for defining the metric. So this is a mechanism which we have been following and which has been pretty helpful for us.
Amazing. I like how you integrate your internal staffs into the process through dogfooding and other measures. That's super impactful and a great first testing ground. Speaking of testing, Shahar, you said that most AI teams are testing less than 1% of their use cases before going to production, where traditional software environments typically test and cover 70 to 80% of use cases. So what does that blind spot actually cost, And what does a minimum viable test plan look like?
I think that the blind spots, and I had several conversations even today with a few folks here, and usually when we think about building software or releasing application out, we think about how much it's going to cost us to build it, and we know once it works, we know what's the potential gain. I think the downside of building AI agents is that the potential damage exists, which never existed in the world of software. So when I built software, and I've been building software for almost 30 years now, there were things I never had to worry about, right? If I built software and it works, it worked well for everybody. The potential damage was just if the software didn't do what it was planned to do. Now we're talking about AI agents that might make mistakes, might insult specific people in the that are interacting with the system, might cause bias. So we've opened a can of worms, if you will, that we now have to deal with. And so when we think about the downside isn't just a broken piece of software. The downside is an agent that recommends your competitor. The downside is an agent that insults specific parts in the population. The downside is an agent that takes actions that's misleading. The downside is an agent that produces wrong documents, and so forth and so forth. And we can continue with a ton of examples. And these are exposures that never existed before until we start rolling these AI-based agents. And I think that the majority of organizations have not made the mind shift yet to understand that there isn't only gain to be made with AI agent, there's a significant risk that's taken there as well. And now add that to what Corinne just said. In the software world, because we have 50 plus years of experience, we have testing tools and test automation and processes and unit testing and whatever. And so when software made it to production in continuous delivery, we kind of knew it's going to work. It's going to work well most of the time. And now we get into agentic and we don't know how to test it, generally speaking. And so we're going to say, let's just let it out there and see what happens. So we've increased the risk and lowered the test. It doesn't really make sense. But if we kind of try to understand what led us here, over the last 3 years, almost every organization in the world was pressured into doing something with AI, either by the board or by their CEO or by LinkedIn, that you got to move faster with AI. And so they start rolling out AI without really thinking through what would success look like or what that needs to be done. And so I think when you're asking what is the right level of coverage, it's industry dependent, right? If I'm driving an autonomous car, I'd like that AI to be really well tested, as an example. I don't know if 100% is reachable, but very close to it. And if I'm building a marketing agent that's answering people's question on my website, maybe not as much. But I still need to understand that I'm not taking any redundant exposure. And so I think it really depends on the business case. And I think that we just need to rethink about what does coverage even look like. You're next, I guess.
Amazing. I think that that's so well said, and I think that the interesting gauge is how damaging can this be? Because we've seen that it's a very challenging environment when your AI failure goes viral on TikTok in about 8 seconds. So that is a very damaging thing for brands, much less for self-driving cars, which are the safety for all consumers is super paramount. So, Chris, Labara took a deliberately cautious approach to productionizing your agents, using narrow use cases, strong fallbacks, and learning from other companies, competitive companies' public failures, which are very easy to read about in the news. Walk us through your go, no-go framework for pushing an AI agent to production.
So I think the first thing to say is just to embellish a bit on what you said there around learning from others' failures. I'm not going to list some of the high-profile ones out there. I'm sure a lot of you know them already. But that allowed us to really set out our stall and set expectations with leadership and the board, because there was a lot of excitement, a lot of hype around AI. They wanted us to do AI without any real clarity on what that meant. And using those high-profile failures allowed us to say to them, look, we are not a tech business. We are a telecoms company that wants to use tech and wants to use AI to be more efficient, more effective, and help us grow, right? We don't need to be bleeding edge. We don't need to be the ones putting ourselves out there and making those public failures. So that being said, in terms of what determines whether we go live, and using the example of our AI chatbot, what did determine when we scaled, first and foremost, you need to be clear what you're trying to achieve, and is it fulfilling at an objective level the tasks you are setting it? And you know, Jahar's point aside about the small amount of testing you can really do if you're doing it manually, that's the first thing you have to answer. And I'm going to gloss over how you go about doing that because Jahar can do a much better job of it than I can. The second thing is, does it fail gracefully? So you are going to have failures. You can't account for every possible permutation and every possible edge case, but you can have a good go at mapping out that unhappy path and saying, if things go wrong, then what? For us, that was give them a human. We had humans before. Give them a human. We're not trying to get to 0 human interaction in a year at the bar. That's not our goal. So that was something that was really important to us. The third thing I would say is, it kind of links to the first one, but I think you've got to be clear on what your metrics are that you're tracking when you go live. So do you have the tracking and the measurement in place for when you go live? Otherwise, you're going to be in the dark about whether a success or not. And then you get in the situation of people's opinions based on, I don't know, someone senior's done some live testing themselves and they don't like answer X or Y. And the last thing for us, because we're in 5 different European markets, covering 7 different languages, it's really important that we put something out there that is usable in all those languages. We started with English, so talking about the cautious approach, we started with English first, just in 2 of our countries. When we were comfortable with that, we then started looking at other languages, and then we looked at other countries as well. So the go, no-go framework for us is very much, be clear what you're trying to achieve, make sure you've got the metrics in place, and then do it step by step. So kind of start narrow and then scale.
Interesting. Can I dig a little deeper into one of your points? Using publicly available failures of other companies, potentially your competitors. Like, how did you apply that in practice? What did that look like?
I think it looked like making sure we had the guardrails in place. So the first thing is anything that isn't a question about a Labara product or service, we have a message that just says, I can only answer questions about Labara products and services. Okay? It's not the most conversational experience, but it's avoiding that situation where it responds and tries to answer questions about our competitors. For example, saying our competitors better, which I've seen examples of chatbots doing that. I think the second thing to think about in terms of how that manifests in practice is, sorry, remind me of a question, Karen? I lost it halfway through.
No, please, continue.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing you need to focus on. I think if you focus on the guardrails that are in place, so anything that was hate speech, anything like that, again, we just refuse to answer that question, and we put someone through to an agent. Because then we can see what they say to the agent, and then we can review the transcript afterwards, and we can use that to then inform how we respond in the chatbot in future. So for us, it's about that fallback and that guardrails. I think they're the 2 things that are important to us. Very,
very practical and useful advice. And as we look at the first year of being in production with an AI agent, Harshdeep, we have a push in 2026 to drive agents into production, regardless of, in some cases, when they're ready or when they're really solid. So, taking that decision and considering that what we've seen with half-built agents causing user attrition, lack of trust, how do you build that feedback loop to make the agent even better in the first place when you go to launch?
So I think the main feedback should not only be explicit from the customers where they report issues based on your agent, but it should also be implicit. How do you define the friction points? At Amazon, we have or for Alexa, we define it through a metric called customer perceived defect rate, which means that when Alexa is answering your question, a customer barging in and asking a follow-up or a multi-turn question on that. So defining implicit signals on how you perceive a customer's friction point is going to be pretty critical. And then figuring out that what will be your long-term fixes versus what can be a short-term fixes. Like, for example, there are ways or there are agents which can now triage your issues coming in from the customer and bucketize them to model issues or ranking and retrieval issues or your content gaps and things like that. Now, some of these will be long poles. Like model training is not something which can happen immediately and be pushed into production. But ranking and retrieval prompt changes are something which can be quickly triaged and fixed. So defining those fallbacks and those mechanisms, I think, are going to be pretty critical in terms of feedback handling.
Amazing. Amazing. And that kind of brings us into some discussion about metrics. And show of hands, who is wholly consumed with metrics out there? Anyone? Okay, well, I am. So I was wondering if, Shahar, you could give us a sense of the metrics needed that give you the highest signal, the greatest signal, as to how an agent is performing. And, as a kind of a follow-on, have you ever pulled an agent back from its production environment?
I'll start with the end. I never had to pull an agent back, but I'm also not in the business of rolling out agents to end consumers, right? We're supporting companies that are building those, and we've seen that multiple times. I think the most important metric, and I think Chris here touched on that, I think somewhere along the lines in the last 3 years, given the velocity of things, we kind of got blindsided, but what is the important metric? And the important metric is eventually, are we providing customer value? And that needs to be measured by industry, by vertical. It's not something that you can generalize. And because we were overwhelmed as a whole with the velocity of how things are happening, and CEO starts pressuring into, hey, let's build something with AI, that it quickly got into becoming a data science or an AI team in the organization leading this, and it became a very technical set of metrics and evaluators, LLM is a judge, and whatever. We looked at every trace and how the technology is working, and almost did not notice that we lost the business impact at the end. And we're seeing projects where we get involved in, cannot name customers, but where we got pulled in, they built a co-pilot or an assistant, or it really depends on the organization, and the product or the business, the GMs come over and say, we've invested whatever in building this, and no one's using it. And we don't understand why. And we go into, okay, let's have a conversation. They pull in the engineering team, and the engineers there are saying, we don't know what they want. All our evals are green, everything's great. But no one's using the platform. How can you say everything's great? And there was a gap between a system that works and zero value to the end customer. So the customers abandoned the application very quickly. So I think the important metric is to define what is the business goal of rolling out that agent. Sometimes it might be, very high levels, you want to cut back on number of support, dollars spent, or tickets open, or time for done. No, it's here. Or time to resolution. It's like, how do you focus on, those are the important metrics. They did not change because you have AI now. They just need to be empowered by AI. And this is where I really agree with Chris. If you stick to those in business goals, then everything else will follow through. If you go and get dragged into, how many evals, how many traces, then it's a completely different challenge. Everything needs to be derived from the business impact that you're looking to achieve and the impact on your customers and users.
Interesting. And, Harshdeep, you mentioned relevance as being a top metric for Amazon, especially for Alexa Plus at the moment. Any other metrics that are top of mind?
I think from accuracy, relevance is a combination of freshness, accuracy, and some other metrics like that. I think from metrics perspective, it's also pretty important to define that you're not only defining for success, but you are covered for failures as well. And in the agentic AI space, it's, as Sahar was mentioning as well, that it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole of creating mistrust with your customers. So it's extremely important to have critical guardrails set in and inferencing the customer friction points which are happening. Like a customer perceived defect rate where a customer barges in when you are actually answering, or customer answering a similar question in a different prompt. Things like that can actually be inferred, but your systems have to be trained on identifying that.
Interesting. So really, understanding not only the initial intent, but the intents along the way in the journey of the conversation. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Perfect. And in terms of understanding people, Chris, can you give us a little bit of context around running production conversational AI and what it requires from a people, process, and operating model standpoint?
Yeah, I think one of the common challenges that people face is launching something in kind of project mode and then not thinking about what's next. And there's a three-letter acronym that I hate that we use all the time at Labara, and everyone uses it, and that's BAU. And this idea that you go from launching something to then being in business as usual mode, where it just kind of runs itself. And so my advice, and I guess my learning there, would be you can have a slightly different team set up for the initial launch to then the ongoing, but just be aware and be ready for it to be something that needs constant nurturing, constant updates, constant tuning. And so you need a product person, in my personal opinion, being a product person. You need someone that balances both the business needs and the technical and the customer needs. So the product person's job is to say, is it viable? Meaning, does it benefit the business in some way, either in the short term or the long term? Is it desirable? Do our users, do our customers actually want to use this thing? And is it feasible? So working with the technology team to understand if those solutions that we think customers need and the business would benefit from, is it possible to launch them? So I think you need that ongoing product management support. And then from the more technical side, you clearly need a very strong team that understands the solution. And I would suggest that they are embedded in your organization rather than, again, you outsourcing all the build and then having a skeleton team afterwards. So I think the operating point of view in terms of the processes you follow will differ by company. My view is always you need just enough structure for it not to be chaos, but not so much structure that it stifles you innovating and improving. So you need some balance whereby you can experiment, but in the ways we've all been talking about experimenting, where you do small-scale experimentations and then scale what works, not ones that get your CEO knocking on your door saying, I heard about what happened to the chatbot in, I don't know, the New York Times. So yeah, that's the balance from a process perspective.
Exactly. Have there been any surprises on your end? Not necessarily failure states, but surprises for your team?
I think after we launched, having done what we thought was quite a lot of testing, and then we sort of launched as a sort of a fake A/B test, if you like, to compare with our previous solution. Even after that, when we started scaling, I was surprised quite how much content we had to change from our knowledge base that the AI was pulling from, and perhaps how much tuning we had to do with the AI. And that comes back to Shahar's point around why you simulate thousands and thousands of interactions, because we had to make more tweaks than perhaps we expected.
I think, I'm sorry, there was no question, but I'll piggyback on what Chris said. I think the gap that we still have a hard time, myself included, to comprehend with AI, that it really deals with almost infinite number of permutations and how people interact with whatever it is we build. People, it's not just what you write or what you ask for, it's how long you wait between turns, it's how much text you write. There's so many different nuances that lead to these weird behaviors. They're not weird, it's just statistical. And I saw a post yesterday, I don't remember by who, but the tagline was around, you cannot put a safeguard around infinity. And so I'm not sure about the exact, if it really meets what I think it does, but at the end of the day, we are dealing with almost infinity. And the closest we can get is really to look at so many different complexities, and just testing for, a happy path or a complicated path gives us a single signal. And it doesn't give us an understanding of how the system will operate in the wild. And that's where, sorry, shit hits the fan.
Yes, it does. And so, when you get that signal, when you understand that something has happened, that's a strange or weird use case that has occurred, how do you diagnose that problem? And then how do you look at model design to kind of rectify it for the future?
I think on the modeling level, probably Harshdeep here can answer better than I can. But I think in an ideal world, you should be able to correlate end user impact to what's happening under the hood. So you have the evals in the right place, you can correlate the event itself and then see where the failure has happened in your system. So you need deep observability into the various elements of the system. There's a lot of different solutions out there that do it differently for a variety of reasons. But you need to be able to correlate end user to anything that's happening under the hood.
I think you covered it pretty well. I think evals is definitely going to be a pretty important use case for product managers in general to define a model efficiency. So setting up your gold standard set on which you define your evals for your model evaluations are definitely going to be the key at the model level.
Yeah, I also think, sorry, just one comment I will add. Similar to by the way, I think that the challenges in the AI world can be replicated from what we've seen in the software world. The way to solve the challenge is completely different. So part of what you need to do is you need to have the comparable of a CI/CD in the software world in the agentic world. So someone touched the prompt, someone updated the RAG system, someone updated the model version. So there are the things that will impact what has changed. So you need to be able to quickly correlate when something has changed and then you saw the impact. I'll give an example. Again, can't name a customer. Last week, we met with a customer of ours, and we showed them that over the last 2 weeks, at some point, their agentic system has started switching languages halfway through the conversation. So at some point, it moved from English, I think it was Spanish, and then the agent kind of forced it to move back to English, and then 2 turns later, moved to Spanish. It's the same conversation. And they're like, when did that happen? And apparently someone opened their language thing a few days later. So once you have CI/CD in place and you can correlate events to CI/CD, then it's far easier to understand when things start breaking.
That's really wild that it switched midstream, mid-convo.
We had that as well, and we consciously turned it off because we wanted to keep things simple to start with, to my earlier point. So yeah, we've seen it too.
Interesting. And that kind of brings us back to the trust issue. When an agent fails in production, fails either an internal team member or an external customer or prospect, when trust breaks, do we find, two-part question here for the panel, but do we find that those customers come back, or do we find that they're a hard sell to get them to re-engage with your product or service? And also, we kind of touched on this, but like your playbook for when an agent goes off rail. Like I'm looking for that specific point where you say, take it down, revert, go to the prior version. Is there anything for your clients or for your companies that where you kind of have that go, no go in prod?
Oh,
go ahead.
Maybe I'll go first, just because there was an outage recently with an Azure server, and it's something we hadn't factored into our unhappy path. And what it meant is that we didn't have monitoring in place. It took a while for us to notice it, and customers were getting stuck where they would send a message to the AI, and they weren't getting an error message. They were just getting nothing. Which actually doesn't show up in your customer metrics as much as you might think, because they're not getting to the point of being able to give the feedback. So that was a learning for us. We took longer than we should have done, even without hindsight being 2020. We took longer than we should have done. We switched to another server. It was a bit slower, but it still meant that we could keep the chatbot running. And then it happened the next day as well. And we responded much faster, but also manually. And off the back of that, we have now implemented a fallback approach whereby if that ever happens again, we have an automated menu, deterministic chatbot as a backup, basically to just avoid putting everyone through to an agent. We have some level of protection for that, whereby they can still do certain things. So that's an example of a failure that we've learned from quite quickly and now have a solution should it happen again. And we didn't think of this while we were doing all our pilot and our testing. So a good example of that too, I think.
So that safety net is very important. Shahar, did you have an example?
Not a specific one, but I think generally speaking, most of the AI capabilities that we're interacting with are augmenting something that existed before, right? You go on your bank site, there is a website, you go on whatever, there's always the other alternative. And so people lose trust very quickly because there's another way to do things, right? I try to use an agent, it wasn't a great experience, it got things wrong, I'll try it once, I'll try it twice, done. Now you'll have to convince me to pull me back into giving it another chance. Why? Because I have an alternative. I'm not going to try it. And I think that's what most organizations have not realized as they released it. And what we're seeing that in a lot of cases, companies are releasing these agents as a nice to have. Oh, there's always a fallback. So if it doesn't work, they can always do it that way. But over several weeks, they're starting to see the interaction decline because nobody wants to there's a customer we worked with that had, I think it was 75% accuracy or 78, something below 80. And, that means that 1 in every 4 turns, it gets something wrong on average. That means that every time I interact with it, I have to figure out, is it one of those 4 times? Or am I in number 3? And it's like, why would I bother? I'll just use the alternative. And then, it's doomed. The agent is doomed. We worked with a customer that told us they know they're at 50% accuracy. They'll start gradually rolling out, and, they'll fix it once they start getting feedback. After 2 weeks, no one touched the system anymore. There was no feedback to be used. And so trust gets lost very, very quickly when there are alternatives. I think companies get crushed when there is no alternative. And so just make sure it works.
I wanted to share a similar example as well. So I work on the news domain for the Amazon models, and news is such a critical piece in terms of relevancy, right? That you have to be at so high relevancy that there's a threshold number of 3. If there are 3 news which are not true, which means they are fake news, are being published or reported as from our systems, the cohort retention drops down to less than 25% for the 90-day retention period. So it's the bar in general for information seeking models has become so high that you just can't afford to be non-relevant in a way.
That is fascinating. And at that scale, that I'm sure happens very quickly. And the team kind of goes quickly to fix it. So, I'd like to start a bit of a rapid round before we go to Q&A if we have time. Looking for just, a 30-second answer or less. But the first question for the entire panel, and feel free to jump in, once an agent is live, what are the top 2 or 3 metrics that actually tell you whether it's succeeding? Not the vanity metrics, but the actual, because I see a lot of, daily active users, weekly active users, but are those kind of relevant, or is it more on the performance side or more on the quality side? So I'll let anyone go ahead with rapid.
I don't mind going first. For us, there's 3. 2 of them are quite customer facing. So did it resolve the customer query? Did the customer like the experience? Because it can resolve your query, but still be awful. And the third is, did it contain the customer within that experience and therefore not need a human agent to help? Because that's the business metric that shows us we're saving money. And that's the order, by the way. Resolve the query, did the customer like it, and did it save money?
Deflection.
Yeah.
I second Chris.
For us, it has been relevance and the inferred metric, which is the customer perceived defect rate. And relevance is a combination of actually accuracy, usefulness, and freshness of the content. And the friction points can be multiple touch points on when a customer did not like the answer, but did not report it specifically. So they're all inferred. So only these 2 top metrics.
Amazing, amazing. Those are great notes. So what broke after launch that your pilot never revealed? Was there something that kind of broke very, very quickly where you realized, or for one of your clients, that, gee, this wasn't as shored up as we thought it was originally?
I don't want to go first every time, because then I get the first answer and you guys have to think of something else. So Harshdeep, do you want to?
I'll give an example that we realized that once our agent, one of our internal agents had gone live, it had somehow started picking up sources which were non-authoritative, although we had licensed publishers as well from news perspective. And it was the internal metrics started reporting lower accuracy, and that is how we realized this happened. But it was very strange to us on why that happened, and then there was a lot of prompt experimentation to be done to fix around that. So yeah, the model picking up non-authoritative sources when it had licensed published sources already available was a surprise.
Why did you do that?
We saw with, again, a very simplistic case, a customer that deployed an agent into their marketing website, but they failed to build in a context reset mechanism. So let's assume Corinne went on that website and did whatever she did, and then I would go in later and it kept calling me Corinne and asking me about things that Corinne provided as context. And so they started to see this mix of information from multiple users in a single conversation, which was quite embarrassing for their customers.
For us, our AI was oversensitive, which is quite sad. Yeah, lack of self-confidence. It was triggering fallbacks when actually it had the right answer. So we'd obviously prompted it into oblivion not to say anything to a customer that could possibly be the wrong answer. And it meant that there was quite a significant proportion where when we looked at the logs, it had the right answer and was saying, sorry, I don't understand. So that was something we learned from launch.
That's a tough line to balance. One more lightning round if we have time. Do we have time? Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So what is one thing this audience should do Monday morning to move their AI agent closer to production?
Start simulating.
Simulating. Explain, please.
Run real user simulations on your agent so you can understand what happens when you roll it into production before your customers do.
I'll keep with the product lens and say, just make sure you're absolutely clear on what you want to achieve with it.
I think my recommendation would be to do a trust audit. I think trust is of prime importance right now, and figuring out how much your users trust your product is extremely important, and ensuring that the agent does not fuel apprehension for your product. Yeah.
A trust audit. Fascinating. I love that. So thank you, panelists. This has been really engaging. Thank you.